Welcome to the BCEN and Friends podcast, where we hold interesting conversations about learning with a range of thought leaders, BCEN certification holders, and industry professionals. Our goal is to create value and insight for you, our professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. We hope you find our discussions interesting, informative, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, and always worth your time.
In this podcast episode, we want to introduce you to our BCEN friend, Zach Kermitz. It takes incremental steps to excel in nursing, and Zach will discuss how he took on specific challenges and gained confidence in his skills. This conversation focuses on the importance of continuous learning, humility, and collaboration in emergency medicine, particularly in ventilator management and toxicology. This episode is called A Song of Flight and Poison.
I'm Holly Briggs, a professional development specialist at BCEN, and one of your hosts for today. I'm joined by my co-host, Michael Dexter, Director of Professional Development at BCEN. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Holly. Great to be with you again.
It's great to have you. And in this episode, we're joined by Zachary Kermitz, a seasoned nurse and flight nurse with a diverse background that spans across multiple states and disciplines. We're excited to gain his insight on challenges and lessons learned. Michael, could you please introduce us to our BCEN friend, Zach?
Yeah, absolutely. Zach began his career in collegiate EMS with the Florida State University Medical Response Unit before moving on to rural EMS in northeastern North Carolina. After earning his BSN, he honed his skills in the emergency department, intensive care, and ground critical care transport nursing across North Carolina, Utah, and New York. In late 2019, Zach transitioned into flight nursing, where he has further developed his leadership skills as a full-time flight nurse in the Four Corners region of the Southwest of the United States. Zach, welcome to the BCN and Friends podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you because you and I have had multiple conversations on all sorts of crazy topics in healthcare. So I hope we can dive into some of those today. But before we do, I did want to ask you a little bit more about your healthcare journey, because you started in EMS, you went into nursing, now flight nursing. So what at the onset of all of this, what was your initial goal? Was it always to be a flight nurse, or what started you out in healthcare, and why did you end up in flight nursing?
I think what really started me out in healthcare was when I was a kid, there was this show back on TLC, back when it was really the learning channel, called Trauma Life in the ER, where they used to just film inside of emergency departments. I have no idea how they could get away with making that today in the HIPAA era that we live in. But I think that really gave me my first introduction to what goes on in the emergency department. And that kind of just captivated my interest at that age. And then when I finally had a chance to just dip my toe into EMS, just doing collegiate EMS, that made me realize that this is what I wanted to do. And I didn't really have that much of a path. I knew it was going to be something involving emergency medicine. But then the first time I ever handed off a patient to a flight crew, that was when I knew, okay, how do I get to do that? Like the moment that they lifted off that first time, I said, that is what I want to do. It was a guy who wrecked his motorcycle in the middle of some cornfields in northeastern North Carolina. And we took him to the local fire department where they had a helipad, and this very nice EC-145 helicopter lands. These two folks get out in their black flight suits. They just had this casual ease about them of, oh, do you want to do this intubation? Oh, no, wait, you did the last one. It's my turn this time around. Super easy going. They tubed this guy and they were out of there in maybe 15 minutes tops. And that's when I knew that's what I wanted to do. And so from there, I just talked to people who knew more about it. People recommended go the nursing route over the medic route. Admittedly, there's a little more money in it. So went to nursing school and really kind of worked my way up to that point. Worked in the ER, worked part-time in an ICU to get the critical care experience, I got my CEN. That was my first board certification. CCRN followed that, and then just built up my resume until the point that I could finally apply. And now here I am and couldn't be happier with it.
Both of us have mentioned this term collegiate EMS. For those listening that might not understand what we're talking about, can you just kind of explain what your initial EMS role looked like when we say that term?
Yeah, it's emergency medical services provided through a university system. In my case, it was Florida State University. It was a volunteer organization, had a couple of paid positions, just BLS, non-transport emergency response. A lot of times there are ways for people to develop resumes for going on to medical and like MD programs. Um, and that was mostly the case for Florida State, though in a lot of parts of the country, they are full ALS ground transport services. I know I've interacted with the University of Vermont has a similar program before because they've picked us up from a helipad at their university medical center, and they're fully staffed transport, as far as I know, advanced life support, but it comes in a couple different flavors.
I found that very interesting. One, that it was a TV show about real people doing real things that inspired you to say, gosh, that seems like that would be an interesting job to have. Maybe I'd like to try it. And then also, as a collegiate EMS person, filling a role that, again, volunteer, you're really kind of dipping your toes into the pace of emergency transport. It's kind of that initial role, but it's like you took these incremental steps towards, and then you had that moment where you saw, like, I think that's what I want to do. And I like how you took, again, just steps towards your goal. And I think sometimes people think, oh, this is what I'd like to do. I hear it often. Oh, I want to be an anesthesia nurse, and, but, or I want to do this. And what I like to tell people is, like, you don't just wake up and become that. Like, you don't just go to
Mm-hmm.
school for a couple of years and that's what you do. You actually have to put in years of practice and study and experience and sitting for exams and sitting for boards. Like, it's a process sometimes to achieve your dream,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that you have definitely shown that, like, you were willing to put in the time to take all of those steps to get your experience, your expertise, your knowledge to where it needed to be. So that way, when the opportunity came along, you were ready and you could step into that role, where I'm sure now you have people who see your team touchdown and y'all come in and they're like, oh, I want to do that. So I think it's now you're that person coming through the door that I'm sure another nurse or maybe another EMS person has looked at and said, I want to do that. So you're kind of inspiring that next generation of who might be falling behind you. So I like the full circle that I'm seeing here for sure. So I will say that one skill set that is used often, and it's really critical to the success in the transport world, is ventilator management. And honestly, this is something that I think a lot of nurses might say, well, that's the ventilator is only for respiratory therapists. That's the RT's job to manage that. I've definitely heard that. I will not admit to having said it before. Maybe early in my career, I might have. But how did you become more competent and confident in something like that? Like, how did you develop that skill?
Right. In that, like, become prior to becoming a flight nurse, I will admit I functionally had zero knowledge of vents. It was probably covered in nursing school, but if we're all being honest, how much do we all remember from nursing school? Yeah, I don't remember everything. And yeah, it was pretty much when I started out in the ER, and it was a busy academic ER. I was told if it beeps, you call RT. That's it. That was the extent of my knowledge. And, I maybe got a little more exposure to it once I started working in ICU environments. But it wasn't something I was really taught. I mean, I sought out a little bit on that subject once I really started working full time in an ICU. but still, you weren't getting hands-on with it. You weren't involved in the decision making necessarily. It's not covered in the CEN, to my knowledge. It's not covered in the CPEN, at least not the exam that I got, or going off of the study materials I had. It was covered in the CCRN, but even then, it was kind of that I just had memorized the things I knew would be on the test, but I couldn't really relate it to patients necessarily. Luckily, the second agency I flew for, the first one I truly flew for full time professionally, not as a volunteer, gave pretty decent vent education to start out. It was with a pretty basic device compared to some of those that are out there nowadays and that a lot of agencies use. And it was taught through this paradigm that I've seen used very commonly to teach ventilator management. And it's a way of thinking about it that will work for probably 95% of the patients that you encounter, but it doesn't really hit on 100%. And it will definitely put you on the peak of the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you're familiar with that curve, where you really feel like you understand things, but then there will come a patient where you will realize, oh, I actually don't fully understand ventilator management. And then you go riding down that curve. Some places that I've flown for gave what I would describe as pretty shockingly minimal vent education compared to what I knew from my own kind of personal development on that subject. And so I knew I had to seek things out. A lot of that was YouTube University. I will give a lot of credit to that. Two books in particular I found to be helpful. One was Eric Bauer's Ventilator Management, the Pre-Hospital Perspective, and William Owen's The Ventilator Book. I found both of those to be really helpful. And then beyond that, I cannot more highly recommend MRAP, Emergency Medicine Reviews and Perspectives, to anyone that works in this field. It's audio and video education at really like, it's meant to be a physician level education program. It is behind a paywall. It is a little pricey, I won't lie, but if you have education money that you can spend on that, you will earn all of your CEs for your renewals like that in a heartbeat. They have fantastic vent programs on there. And other podcasts, Internet Book of Critical Care was super helpful. And then really beyond the kind of formal didactic education, I really couldn't stress enough the need to dedicate time to sitting with the vent and a test lung for yourself. When you have downtime, plug a circuit in, plug it into a test lung, and just watch and listen to what the vent is doing. And it'll give you a much better sense of how that translates to an actual patient. And along the way of acquiring my vent management skills, and to be explicitly clear, I do not consider myself the paragon of nursing transport ventilator management by any means. But I would say I'm at least fairly knowledgeable on the subject. I've done a lot of learning independently on that, putting together materials on that subject. One of the other things that really comes into that is humility. Is I feel like once people get into the transport environment where now we have a lot of autonomy, which isn't always something you have as a nurse. Sometimes it gets to people's heads, and I won't lie, myself included, when you find yourself with a situation where you have come to realize, oh, my education no longer works and I don't know what to do anymore, is having the humility to call for help. And every single consultant that I've ever called with a very difficult to manage ventilator patient has been extremely helpful. They've been kind, they've been understanding, they've been patient. But if you don't have that humility to know, oh, I'm out of my league on this one, you're going to get yourself and your patient in a lot of trouble. And then lastly, the other thing, and this isn't just applicable to ventilator management, but we all have access to this extremely high fidelity, low cost simulator at all times. And that is just your own brain. And that is, if you don't have the vent in front of you, is to sit there and think to yourself, what would I do in this situation? Give yourself some situation and work yourself through it. And I've spent a lot of time on that with things like vents, with things like surgical airway, kind of the things that get added into your scope once you become a flight nurse. And over time, it's been really effective at building up those skills.
I was going to say you built those skills during COVID too. And I think that
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
probably one of the things that we should talk about is there was a lot of ventilatory recommendations that happened during COVID that changed over time. And so
Mm-hmm.
maybe you could talk a little bit about how you navigated that whole world as well.
I think there again, FOMED, free open access medical education sources were huge because, things so early on changed at such a rapid pace that the ways that we typically acquire our knowledge through things as slow moving as textbooks to kind of education briefings that come out from organizations like, say, the BCEN, those take a little more time than what we needed. And it was really through those FOMED sources, websites, podcasts. Again, I hammer that home with everybody. That's where that information came from. I really felt like even a lot of the things that we got kind of formally from the agencies that I worked for, the transport agencies, a lot of times was just distilled kind of FOMED sources. So I've always found that paying attention to those was really where that came from. And then beyond that, I think one of the other things that came out of COVID in terms of learning and adapting is something that we're already pretty good at as nurses, which is just collaboration. Like we're used to finding solutions for sticky situations, like a challenging discharge that you have to work through some kind of solution with social work on, or someone that needs to be admitted, but there's conflicts between members of an admitting team about where's the patient going to go, whose service is it going to go to, those kind of things that we're used to working through. I think our skills as collaborators really helped disseminate that information to us a lot more quickly because we were able to get it from a lot of different sources and then distill it down into the essentials. That's where I really think those lessons kind of came from in a more rapid pace.
Well, during that time, and I don't want this whole podcast to be about COVID, there's a lot of other subjects as well, but you worked in New York City, which I remember being one of the hot spots of COVID at a particular time during the pandemic. You were also on the Navajo Nation in the Southwest, and I was there at the time as well. And I know, although the volume was very different, there was a lot of challenges in both of those populations. Maybe you could just let us know a little bit about how that grew you as a clinician and some of the things you learned just in general about patient care and quick thinking and those concepts from having worked in those environments.
Yeah, I'll never forget those times. I started full-time professional flight nursing in December of 2019 in New York, and never would have thought that within a couple months we would be flying our little PC-12 down to LaGuardia, like an airport that you would never fly into for medevac purposes because of the amount of commercial traffic going in there. Flying down there, the radio was like silent because there was no air traffic. And we flew by the Empire State Building and when it was lit up in flashing red light. Like that's what we went down there for, to help evacuate hospitals that had been just overwhelmed. And you had to learn quickly, kind of like we talked about before with finding that information. But one of the other things that, again, we were probably, all pretty good at as nurses to begin with, but really our experience grew very rapidly in was problem solving. We found ourselves as time wore on having to take care of these situations that you never really found yourself in before. Like a patient who had both COVID pneumonia and diabetic ketoacidosis. Those are very different ventilator management schemes. And finding some kind of balance between them to get someone from point A to point B. That required a lot of problem solving. There again, the humility to seek out help, collaborating with other people, or just wild situations that you never would have thought of, like a patient who was intubated for COVID pneumonia, had a known cuff leak when we arrived, but the referring physician was adamantly refusing to re-intubate the patient because of how difficult they were to intubate to begin with. Those are not in textbooks. And so you would have to find those solutions from the right people. It's something that I think has kind of stuck with us ever since. At least I hope it did. I guess we'll find out.
Oh man, just hearing you talk about some of those lessons learned, it gave me time to reflect on that time in nursing. I had been a nurse for a while when COVID happened, but actually my sister had just graduated nursing school in 2019, December 2019. So she was a baby nurse in an ER right
Wow.
during kind of came out of orientation right during the height of COVID. And I remember some of the conversations we were having, and it just the usual advice that you would give to someone new in nursing. I was like, this really doesn't apply. I wish it did apply right now, but it was kind of like she'd have questions about me, like the practice or what they were doing. And I'm like, right now, look on the internet, like things that you're like, this is maybe not the best. This is not the advice I would like to give, but currently it's the best that I have to give.
Mm-hmm.
So just thinking back on those times, but I agree with you that there were so many key takeaways as far as what you said, things that nurses have been good at doing and maybe were sharpened during those times, like the ability to problem solve, the ability to collaborate, think on our feet, come up with solutions, because at the end of the day, the patients needed us to be the answer for the problems that they were facing. And again, sometimes it's just that it's almost like the MacGyver mentality, or the ability to be like, okay, this is going to work for this person today. This may not be the solution tomorrow. So don't write it down in pen. Like this is definitely a pencil situation. So, but yeah, I appreciate hearing that. And I love the different characteristics that you've been able to kind of draw out from that experience. And I certainly hope that when people in healthcare during that time reflect on that, that they also see that there were some things, positive things that came out of it for the very, very difficult and challenging time that it was. I'm going to kind of change the subject just a little bit, mostly because you have a special interest in toxicology, which I absolutely find fascinating to listen to people who that is an interest, their specialty. Some people, it's their passion. A physician that I used to work with, he was the toxicology department head. And so like he would be over here doing ER things, and then he would just spill this knowledge about, oh, this is actually what's going to happen to this patient who overdosed on this drug. And you're just like, wow,
Mm-hmm.
I did not know that to that degree. And so I loved being able to gain insight. So how did this really become an interest for you? And if you can just kind of tell us, like, what was kind of a big learning moment for you taking on the study of toxicology?
I think what really gave me my interest in it is the really dramatic presentations that you can see with patients that kind of fall under that umbrella of disease processes. Like if you get a true case of serotonin syndrome or like anticholinergic toxicity, someone who did the Benadryl challenge, that's going to make for an interesting night. That is probably going to be, there you go. There's the problem solving and the collaboration. That's where you're going to be collaborating with everyone in the department to just get that person safely into a bed, and then keep them there and manage their disease process once you finally kind of have a safe environment to even work in. And one of the other things that really generated my interest in toxicology is my interest in the history of medicine, where they're like one of the more colorful figures in the history of the development of modern medicine is a guy named Paracelsus, who played a really notable role in developing some of the principles of modern toxicology. And he's a very interesting figure that I would encourage people to read about in their own time. because he developed a lot of these principles, not necessarily himself developed a lot of these principles that are fundamental to toxicology, but also you read about things that he was like way off on, just these wacky old time treatments for various diseases. So a lot of those like kind of historical figures prompted my interest in toxicology. And also, I think just because you get to do some really kind of exotic things with toxicology patients. There's not a lot of other times that you're going to give a 1 unit per kilo insulin bolus to someone and then start them on potentially like a 5 unit per kilo per hour drip if they have a beta blocker toxicity. And there's just the other kind of exotica that you don't get to do all that often, and things that really you kind of have to understand why you're doing. Like if someone overdoses on Depakote, why are you going to give them ertapenem or meropenem, like an antibiotic? Well, it's because it accelerates the metabolism of Depakote. Those are just kind of things you don't get to do every day. Emergent dialysis, ECMO. It's a lot of the cool stuff at the end of the day, I kind of think of. And beyond that, a lot of those therapies are really satisfying to me because you get to see them work in real time. Like if you get someone in, one of your rooms and they have, they're septic and you give them antibiotics, they're not going to work right away. That person is not going to get better in front of your own eyes necessarily because of one dose of IV antibiotics. But whereas if you have someone who has like a real deal like tricyclic antidepressant overdose, as you push the bicarb, you see their QRS like narrow. And I find that to be like really satisfying to see what you're doing work in real time instead of that delayed gratification necessarily. I think one that we're all way too familiar with is naloxone. That first time there again is like a new nurse that you see someone get Narcan and you're like, they come back to life right in front of your eyes. Like that's toxicology in action. And so I think that's one of the things that really has piqued my interest in it. And then actually to go back to COVID, in terms of like things I've really taken away from toxicology is that the critical thinking, but also avoiding complacency. One of the mantras that I operate on is a real simple one, and it's just complacency kills. And that's especially true in the aviation world. But one of the things that COVID kind of taught us, and that equally applies to a lot of tox patients, is that disease processes can mimic lots of other disease processes. That patient that came in with seemingly a case of COVID, upper respiratory infection, cough, coryza, the person you saw, 1,000 times during that period of time, but was also like a little too tachycardic. You couldn't fall for that because it turned out, yes, they had an upper respiratory infection from COVID, but they also had myocarditis. And you have to pick up on those things that don't fit the pattern that you think that patient is falling into. Kind of generally speaking, if you had a patient in one of your rooms and you knew nothing more than the fact that they had a fever, they were tachypnic, and they had altered mental status, it's very easy to say sepsis. We're easy, anyone can pick up on that. They actually have a salicylate toxicity because that also causes fever, tachypnea, and altered mental status. And the way that those things, particularly with toxicology, can mimic other diseases, I've always found to be really interesting. And so by being aware of those and avoiding complacency, you can pick up on that patient where we've gone down this treatment pathway for, let's say, sepsis, but they are just not getting better. They're not responding in the way you would expect them to. That's where you have to stop and think, hey, is this actually what we were thinking it was before? And while I wouldn't like advocate for people to go off and become like zebra hunters necessarily, just keep those things in the back of your mind. Like, is it a little more than what we thought it was before? And I just found a lot of times that is toxicology patients.
Well, Zach, I think we can talk about this stuff all day. You
Oh,
clearly
I can. Yeah.
love to chat about it. I remember another time you and I talked, we talked about the giggly saw and the whole history behind that and
Oh,
amputations.
yeah. 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 Oof,
So
that's a good read. Yeah.
there's a lot of medical information in your brain, and it takes a lot of passion for what we do to really focus in on a lot of the things that you're talking about. And we like to ask people on all of these podcasts if there's any particular moment in your career or any person that really impacted you as an individual. And I would like to think that there's probably more than one, especially with the passion you have for so many topics of healthcare. But just out of curiosity, any particular time in your career that really defined what you're doing, or any person that really helped mentor you along the way?
Yeah, you're right. There's so many people along the way that helped get me to where I am now. And if I listed off all of those names, y'all would have to play me off. But there's one in particular was Dr. Steve Barmack, who I used to work with at Duke Regional. And I think he had the perfect balance between having just a really great knowledge base of emergency medicine and the problem solving and the clinical skills. Like that guy could put in a dirty fem line in the middle of like a cardiac arrest as fast as anyone I've ever seen, but also had compassion for people. And I try to maintain, like, have that balance between the interpersonal skills and the clinical skills, and almost tying that into, not falling for, not becoming complacent. There was one night, kind of earlier in the morning on a night shift, that we had a patient come in. They're brought in by EMS for a kidney stone, and it was me and Barmack saw the patient. And I remember, I was a pretty new nurse still at this time. And I was looking at this guy. I'm like, man, he's really rolling around in bed. I don't think this is this is a pretty awful kidney stone, if that's what this really is. And I'm doing my triage and I go to get his temperature and the thermometer won't read. And this is something I've learned through the years. When you put in an oral thermometer in a patient's mouth and it doesn't register, that makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck now. That's because either A, your thermometer doesn't work. Let's be honest, they get worn out. Then you got to run around the department, find the probe that'll clip onto that one, all just to finish your triage. Or it's because they are so vasoconstricted to maintain their perfusion that the thermometer won't even read in their mouth because there's no blood flow going up there. And I was like, man, the thermometer won't read on this guy. And he just looks so uncomfortable. Something is just not right about him. And I don't remember what else it was, but finally I was like, Barmack, will you just look at this guy again? I don't think this is a kidney stone. And he kind of, I told him what was going on, and he'd ordered a renal CT for the guy. And I remember, I'll never forget this. He went and looked at him. He said, Zach, I'm going to go to the scanner with you. And I knew, I was like, oh, something's wrong. I've never had a doc go to the scanner with me before. And that was the first time I ever saw a ruptured AAA on a CT scan. And sure enough, by the time we got back to the ER, now he was like cold to the touch. And we called for blood immediately. Everyone's in the room, more lines are going in. We're calling for transfer to go over to the big university medical center. And that, I'll never forget, that taught me that, like, when someone isn't fitting into that pattern, you can't keep going along with what you're doing. Something isn't right. You have to think and change what you're doing. And it was such a vivid example of that. I think I even might have taken the call from EMS. You think kidney stone, you know what we're going to do. Probably pop an IV in, give some fluids, give some ketorolac, maybe a little opiates, get a UA, basic blood work, maybe CT scan. Pain's under control, nausea's under control, go home, right? We've done that 100 times. But it was just to look at the guy once you finally saw him, and you just, the hair stood up on the back of my neck because of those things. And that's how I really learned that lesson and had it hammered home. What was that little vignette right there?
That is an amazing story. And I think that honestly, it behooves every single nurse to have a moment like that where you look at a patient and something isn't right. And instead of just continuing down the path, it's almost like the path of
Yeah.
resistance or that path of
Yeah.
experience where you're like, this is just, it's fine. Instead of doing that, you actually go, hey, do you mind coming and looking at this patient again? I just have this.
Hmm.
Again, sometimes there are like slight variances, but when you add them all up, they give you that pause and they give you the hair on the back of your neck kind of
Hmm.
stands up a little bit and you have enough confidence in you to ask the question and you see how quickly that ability to like pivot onto something else can impact the life of that patient and the trickle down effect of that is their family and loved ones, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's
Truly.
it's one of those things I'm like I hope that every nurse has that moment because it's such a pivotal moment in your career and then when you feel that again you don't ignore it. And sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes it comes back and it's like it wasn't it wasn't anything else. You ruled everything else and we're good. But when you have that one where what you did and how you called attention to those little inconsistencies, it's a very defining moment. So thank you for sharing yours with us. And so I now am going to shift the podcast yet again. We're going to ask some rapid fire questions. I'm really interested in this because you have so many interests. So I'm like, now I don't even know, but what would you do if you were not in your current role? Like, what's a career, a role, a job that you considered trying that you would do instead of what you are doing?
That for me is probably archaeology. When I was like a little kid, that's what I wanted to do. And I kind of get to just there you go, almost dip my toe into it a little bit, just vicariously, because I volunteer for the National Park Service in my time off and at a park, Aztec Ruins National Monument, that is a cultural history park. And so I get to interact with actual archaeologists and actual museum curators. And it gives me just enough exposure to still kind of fulfill that childhood dream of having been an archaeologist, I would say.
That is honestly, I should have expected that because I am not surprised. I'm not surprised at all, Zach. I could totally see you doing like a whole almost Indiana Jones situation, maybe a little bit like, Jurassic Park. I don't know. I don't know. I see it.
Mm-hmm.
I see it. So it's not a leap for me. We are going to move right into your favorites, and these are really just so that we can get to know you just a little bit better. All right. So, favorite book, or maybe it's a quote that really inspires you.
My favorite book, admittedly, is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. That's pretty heavy and pretty dark, but I would say maybe one that people are a little more familiar with. Huge fan of the Song of Ice and Fire series, the actual books themselves. As someone that lives in New Mexico, eagerly awaiting the New Mexico resident author to finally finish those. But um, aside from that, another quote that is really important to me is slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I won't deny there are times where actual, like, if we're talking about winning a race, whoever's fastest is going to win. But when it comes to working through a lot of things like we talked about today, problem solving, maybe even collaboration a little bit, I have found that to be especially helpful. And it was a little tidbit of wisdom that very crusty old paramedic gave me in the back of an ambulance. I'll never forget, outside of a nursing home, probably 3 a.m. And ever since then, it's something that's really guided a lot of the way I work professionally, a lot of how I go through life. I'm a bit of a lollygagger. I like to stop and smell the flowers. I love to hike. I will always be the last one in the group because I am soaking it in, taking my time, enjoying it. Then also, everyone always asks for all your pictures, all the people up front who are in the fast group, who zoom through a hike. then they get back to the trailhead with you and they're like, "Oh, did you take a bunch of pictures?" I'm like, "Yeah, I did," because I actually kind of slowed down and enjoyed it. So that's one that has guided me a lot. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And yes, some of us are anxiously awaiting the next book. Okay. We've
Yes.
been waiting for a long time. We'll continue to wait. I'll still burn that candle with you. All right. Favorite movie, TV show, or a binge-worthy series that you'd recommend? Because we're always looking for the next thing.
Movie wise, probably Star Wars Rogue One. Bingeable series. I am working my way through Veep right now at the recommendation of my friend that lives in DC. He says it is practically a documentary as someone that works in government. And I've found it to always be pretty reliable for a laugh.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've heard similar about Veep, so interesting. I haven't started it yet, but I will definitely put that somewhat maybe a little bit higher up on the list. So thanks. Favorite song or
Mhm.
maybe a musical artist that just kind of can move you? Something you'd recommend?
I would say that would be a band based in Salt Lake City called Pixie and the Party Grass Boys. Saw them at a small venue in that city and have just kind of followed their trajectory over the years. It's kind of funky bluegrass music if that's your thing. I've even gone on a river rafting trip with them. Probably one of the most relaxing experiences in my life to get to raft, a wild river in Colorado and have them play at night. It's a memory I go back to a lot for sure.
That's awesome. I wrote them down. I've never heard of them, but I love hearing about artists maybe that aren't some big broad name that everybody would know. But if you're recommending them, I will give them a listen. And I have been pleasantly surprised. So can't wait.
Great.
I can't wait to look them up. All right. My last question for you in this rapid fire section is, do you have a self-care go-to or maybe a way that helps you reset, get back to yourself?
Anything outdoors, I pretty much do it all from ice climbing to backpacking. But if there's one in particular, it's birding. I can't recommend that enough to people in terms of something that is great for just shedding stress. It's something you can do anywhere, regardless of if you live in an extremely large, built up urban environment, or if you're like me and you live out in the boonies. There are fascinating, beautiful birds everywhere to be found. Their songs, melodious, relaxing. I think the world would genuinely be a better place if like everyone was a birder. That is like a little thing I will get up on my soapbox about. Yeah.
And if you were on a soapbox talking about it, I would pause to listen because I'd be like,
Oh, well,
wait,
thank you.
I was like, wait, he's figured out how to make people better. Let's go. Yeah, let's do it. Ah, well, thank you for sharing all that with us, Zach. And if our audience would like to follow you on after this podcast, is there some way that they can reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm not really a big social media guy, but I do have an email I use for things like this, nursing under night vision at gmail.com. I'll answer any questions. Feel free to send them on.
Awesome. Well, I will include that email address in the blog for this podcast episode. So again, thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah, sure thing.
I'm glad you'll answer any question because I have some questions about high altitude pulmonary edema in conjunction with overdosing and traumatic fall injury. So if we can just put all of this together in one package, I'm sure I'll run it by you, Zach. But in all seriousness, I
Fire
really
away.
enjoy talking with you. I really enjoy picking your brain. I think it's fascinating to chat with somebody that has a true passion and love for all things nursing, and especially with the things that you've done in the terms of the transport and critical care world. So thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself and all your passions with us today. And we really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Oh, sure thing. Thanks for having me on.
I want to take this time to thank Zach for joining us for this episode of BCN and Friends. Zach, thanks for sharing your perspectives, your experience, and honestly, your spirit of adventure. Your curiosity and desire to grow has opened a lot of doors that were not only for yourself to expand your own professional knowledge, but you've also turned around to educate and impact others with what you've learned. We can't wait to see you in person at Learn Live in Colorado Springs, where you're going to do that deep dive pre-conference session on ventilators, and as well as a main conference session on toxicology. So we will get to hear more, and honestly, I can't wait. We truly appreciate you and all that you are doing. And to all of our listeners, we hope you'll stay tuned as we continue with BCN and Friends and bring you new, meaningful content and perspectives. If you have a suggestion for an episode, please email us at bcn@bcn.org. I'm Holly Briggs here with Michael Dexter, and on behalf of the entire BCN team, we thank and celebrate you for all that you're doing as professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. Until next time, we are out.